Now, how many times do you check your phone, social media, or use the internet in a day? Do you think you could go for a whole 24 hours without it? Well, today is National Unplugging Day, and families across the country are being encouraged to switch off their technology and get back to basics. Texting, typing and tapping, we're all at it, and increasingly so. On average, we now spend 8 hours and 40 minutes a day attached to mobile devices. Our phones are the first thing most of us check when we wake up, and the last thing we look at before we go to sleep. In fact, we're now online more than we're sleeping, and more so for children, who are now on the internet for 14 hours a day. And what about our addiction to social media? We're Facebooking, tweeting and Instagramming our lives on average for an hour and 20 minutes in any given day. So what is all this doing to our brains and our relationships? Yeah, that's the question. I'm really looking forward to discussing this one. With me in the studio, Sangeet Bhullar from Wise Kids, a group promoting positive and safe internet use for children, and Professor Phil Reid, who's carried out some interesting research on web addiction. Thanks very much for coming to talk to me. I'm going to start on that very strong word, addiction. Is it possible to be addicted, Phil, to using technology and phones?
In the sense that it's possible to be addicted to things like gambling, then yes, it's the same, and the analogy is there, that this is an activity that takes over somebody's life and it starts disrupting their work, their social relationships, makes it difficult for them to connect in the same way that we would like to connect with other people.
So you carried out some research here in Wales and with, I think, a European university as well, is that right? And what was the main finding from this? That it actually could be quite serious, that if people are addicted to using their phones and internet, there could be problems, including depression, is that right?
It's quite long been known that people who use the internet a lot do report more depression. And it seems to be both that depressed people tend to access the internet more, and once they've accessed it, they tend to get more depressed as a consequence of that. Our research was looking at whether you actually get psychological withdrawal from the internet, and we found that using something like the Internet Addiction Test, people who scored highly on that, which is a measure of how much it disrupts their lives, you give them a little session on the internet and then you measure their mood changes between before and after, and you find pronounced negative mood swings when you cut them off. And that's very similar to things like sort of ecstasy and other drugs, where you get that kind of switch to a more negative mood set.
I mean, I'm hearing you saying all this. It sounds really scary. And I think, Sangeet, I'd be right in probably thinking that parents already trying to keep up with their kids with this technology, it's a struggle in itself. They hear that, you know, my child could become addicted to using the internet. That's going to set alarm bells off, isn't it?
I think it is. I think the key word really is balance. And I think, you know, I also work with some vulnerable groups. And it's interesting because it's a bit of a mixed bag, you know, and I think your predisposition to the internet, basically, you know, if let's say you're feeling depressed but you're looking online for help and support, you're far more likely to use that for good. And in fact, we had a case, a young lady who shared a story who said that when she was about 12 or 13, she had severe depression. And she said, but I'm tired of all you adults using the R word. And she said, you know, for me, all you ever talk about is the internet and risk. I want you to know, and she was speaking at a conference, that without the internet, I wouldn't be here today. Because at age 12, 13, she was very self-aware, intelligent, and she was looking online for support because she knew she wasn't like anybody else around her. And she found forums that gave her help and support, so much so she set up her own forum to help children with depression. So
you'd say there are pros and cons to this. I mean, the fact is, I mean, this is to both of you really, it's not going anywhere, is it? I mean, we're not going to be going backwards in terms of this. I mean, I'm wondering, have you both managed to turn your phones off during this interview and not have the urge to look at your phones? Or
That's easy enough for me, because I simply don't have a mobile phone, and you manage perfectly well without one.
I think there's shock in both our faces here, Sangeet. You actually don't have a mobile phone. Isn't it interesting, though, that to hear you say that, I'm kind of thinking, how can you not have a mobile phone? How do you survive? I mean, that's the point of this, isn't it? That I cannot believe that you don't have one.
It kind of is. I think it's so intimately connected with our lives and everything we do. It is hard for people to think about how you could manage without.
But you do.
But you can, quite easily. There are many other forms of communication you can use. But going back to a point that was made, yes, it is about balance. And we'd have to say 80% of activity on the internet is harmless and pointless.
I would disagree with that, but there we are.
It's a bit of fun for most people, and you can take something out of it.
Because you actually, Sangeet, think that, you know, that technology, the internet, it's an enabler. It's actually something that can open a world up.
Yeah, I think you know, having been a user of technology and probably having not had a computer until university and getting online, I think in the field of education, which is really where I'm working mostly, I see education being transformed with pupils owning their learning because they can be content creators, because they can be collaborators, networkers. The key issue here is digital skills. Young people need the knowledge, skills, critical awareness, self-regulation to understand how to use these technologies meaningfully in a balanced way. And so parents have a big role in that, to make sure that they're actually getting out, socializing, sleeping properly, that phones are turned off at bedtime. Yes. Practical things. Actually parenting around digital, which I think sometimes is missing.
So you have slightly different takes on this. I'm wondering whether there might be some agreement in the studio here on the etiquette of this technology, because actually in some of these newspapers laid out here, it's been a big story this week. There was a big supermarket company where a checkout assistant refused to serve somebody in the queue because they were loading their bags whilst on the phone. Everywhere you look, restaurants, you see people sitting opposite each other, holding a phone and texting someone. It's starting to take over, isn't it?
But it's more than about social etiquette. It's about skills of how this should be used and how we can incorporate it into our lives to make it a benefit and not a drawback. Those kind of examples you just quoted, and the phubbing example where you ignore somebody to go on your phone.
Yeah.
It's rude, but it's also demonstrating a lack of skill.
So that's something actually that should be brought in maybe as part of the education.
And one of my concerns is, you know, parents, for example, there's been a lot of studies starting to come out now about parents actually being so distracted by mobile devices that they're not paying attention to their children. And I think listening, actual contact time, bedtime without your technology necessarily, or using the technology with the child, you know, is absolutely key.
Well, this is one we could talk about for a long time. We're going to come back to this as a topic, and hopefully you've had a few text messages during this interview. Phil, that won't apply to you because you haven't got a phone. I'm still amazed at that, but thanks for talking to us.